Hello, this is Michael, and I'm going to say a few words about textual hermeneutics. When I say textual hermeneutics, I'm reaching back to ancient Greece, to Hermes, the messenger, the one whose purpose it was to explain to human beings the meaning of the gods' decisions and actions. Hermeneutics, then, involves the pursuit of interpretation, of explanation, and of meaning in the written word, which became increasingly important as oral traditions gave way to written texts. When hermeneutics was formally named and defined, it was within religious contexts, where different yet internally coherent interpretations led to different traditions and communities of belief and practice. Theologian and philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher refined hermeneutics and began its return to a broader philosophical scope. In doing textual hermeneutics, we begin with several assumptions. First is that written words have the potential to communicate meaning from one individual or group to another. We assume that there is, or that there can be, a link between a text and a reader. And we assume that an understanding of the text's meaning can have practical implications for the future. In other words, we assume that the question, "What does this mean?" includes the possibility of application, a change in thought or practice, a new idea, a new way of looking at the world. In the next slide, I have something for us to practice with, but before we dive into that text, we'll need a framework for our approach. Here's one example. Although our focus is the text, we will also want to consider the author. It stands to reason that knowing who wrote something, if it is possible to know that, will add to our understanding of what is written. We may also consider the historical context. What purpose might the author have had when writing this? What was happening at the time? Who is the intended audience, and how might they have understood this? We should also give some thought to ourselves and the perspective that we are bringing to this. Why did we choose to read this in the first place? Does our own background and our own pre-existing point of view influence our reading of the text? If so, how? In other words, reflexivity is an important element in textual hermeneutics. Finally, just as we consider the historical context it comes from, we also consider the contemporary context which it comes to. How does this relate what is happening in the world today? How might other readers understand it? How might the message of the text find meaningful application? Okay, let's do some textual hermeneutics. I'll start with reading this passage. That a larger proportion of women than of men are unfit for practice will, I think, be acknowledged. On the one hand, a relatively larger proportion of the former are adapted to scientific work, and it is a most encouraging feature to see so many women taking up laboratory life. In chemistry, histology, pathology, embryology, bacteriology, and even in anatomy, the work which they are doing is everywhere attracting attention. Here they meet men as equals, since what they lack in initiative and independence is counterbalanced by a more delicate technique, a greater patience with minutiae, and a greater mastery of detail. In the scientific life, too, woman escapes those little rebuffs and slights so trying to a sensitive nature, and to which it is not good for a woman to become so hardened that they do not hurt. Well, this is interesting. Let's remember that framework as we approach this. First, who wrote this? We see that the author is none other than Sir William Osler, the patron saint of modern medical education. The occasion was a speech memorializing Mary Putnam Jacobi, the first woman to study medicine at the University of Paris. Working in New York, she was highly esteemed as a clinical physician, teacher, scientist, writer, social reformer, and as a harsh critic of the exclusion of women from the professions. The purpose then was to honor a leader of the field who had recently died. Given the historical context of 1907, these statements might have sounded progressive, at least to the men in the audience, though one does wonder what response Mary Putnam Jacobi might have had to some of this. How do our own perspectives influence our reading of this passage? In 2018, we might consider how women's experiences in professional life have progressed since 1907. Or we might be struck by how little things have changed, or even have gotten more difficult. How might this passage find some meaningful application today? There are other frameworks. Michael Crotty, in his overview of social research paradigms, describes approaching a text by reading it in 3 successive ways. First is to read it empathically, with the single goal of understanding the author and what they are trying to communicate. The challenge here is to read with openness and receptivity, listening, as it were, for the voice of the author speaking to us. Next is to read it interactively. In this way, we work toward a dialogue, a conversation with the author, now allowing our own ideas to interact with the text. This dialogue may even become a debate when we find that we disagree. Finally, we can read transactionally. Reading at this level, we produce not simply a refinement of our own ideas, nor of ideas that were in the author's mind, but something completely new, a construction only produced through an intellectual transaction between the author's words and our own disciplined reading. So, when I say textual hermeneutics, I mean a disciplined process of looking for meaning in the written word. As scholars and writers, textual hermeneutics encourages us to consider our words carefully. What we write today may be used as a study sample by some future researcher. In fact, our words may have a meaning to future readers that is radically different, even the opposite of what we intend to communicate today. Finally, practicing our skill in textual hermeneutics makes us better readers. And if we are better readers, we will be better writers. And then still better readers, and so on, and so on, and so on. Thank you for watching.